Hello and welcome to another Turnstile Tours program. I'm Stephen D.W. Coming to you from Flushing, Queens, formerly Lenape Land, here in the eastern end of New York City. And once again, we are looking at New York City's waterfront today, looking at a figure who looms large in the history of New York City's waterfront, or ought to, but is too frequently overlooked. We're going to talk about a guy named Pete Panto with Nathan Ward, author of Dark Harbor, and also with Joseph Sciorra, who is a folklorist and focuses on Italian American history. As I mentioned, Dark Harbor is the book that Nathan Ward wrote. I highly recommend it. It gets into this fantastic narrative, very exciting story, a drama centered on a newspaperman who uncovered a terrible story of waterfront corruption, and that series of articles left significant footprints in our culture. But the guy at the center of it gets too often overlooked. And as I said, so we're going to talk to Nathan Ward here and Joseph Sciorra. And I'd like to invite you both to join us here. Tell us a bit about how you discovered the story and how you view it. And we're thrilled to have you with us today. Hello, Joseph.
Hey there, Stefan.
And here's Nathan.
Hello.
Welcome you both. So to begin with, we're talking about waterfront corruption. We're talking about this guy Pete Panto. What's when we talk about waterfront corruption, what do we mean by that?
Well, I suppose we mean what. Well, let's look at it as Pete Panto discovered it on the job. So he came here. He came down to the waterfront in the mid-30s. He was a hiring boss on a pier by 38, 39. And he quickly learned that in order to get hired each morning in these things called a shape up, where you would be, that day's crew would be picked, you had to pay all kinds of things. You had to pay the barber they wanted you to pay, whether you went there or not. You had to buy the wine grapes they wanted you to buy, whether you made wine or not. There were all these hidden costs to show that you were paid up and in good standing and should be hired that day. And, so all the things that you see in the movies where they have the cigarette behind the ear or the button on his hat, I started out because I thought, that's got to be over the top Hollywood stuff. And it all comes from a thing called the New York Crime Commission hearings, where people, everyone in America watched this thing. It was like the Watergate hearings, or, and it was just full of these details that Bud Schulberg put into his movie On the Waterfront, including most of the really good quotes, like, I'm proud of what I've done, or, I take it out of their skulls. But all those things were real quotes from testifying longshoremen.
So was that your route into this? Is that how you engaged with the story? Was from the movie On the Waterfront? What brought you to this?
Well, I moved to Carroll Gardens in 1990. I loved it there, but there was a lot I didn't understand about the old. When the neighborhood was a real longshoreman's neighborhood. My landlord was a longshoreman who was missing a lot of fingers, but my Italian wasn't good enough, and his English was not where it was, and so we could say good evening, and I had coffee with their family, but it left me wondering, I had never lived anywhere where there were pigeon coops before. Everything that I knew from this movie was there. And so I got more interested in it. And then I was writing a novel. And while I was doing that, I discovered this story of Mike Johnson, the reporter, who had done a series of 24 articles about waterfront corruption in 1948. And I was like, it's so unusual that anyone did any story that long in those days, let alone about what you weren't supposed to write about, which was waterfront corruption and the gangs that held the different territories.
That
and
really
so then
comes
I
through in
quickly,
your book. That I love that you mentioned that it was the length of the series that caught your attention. You
yes,
set up in your book. You set up this fantastic drama of this paper that's really down on its luck and really kind of entering its last years in operation, and that there's this. It feels like a Hollywood drama where this reporter who's very deeply respected uncovers the story, and he's given rope to take where he will with it, and uncovers, like you say, a story that people weren't supposed to talk about.
right. Well, no, you were never supposed to mention the mob itself, and you never were supposed to mention the guy who had the most power in the harbor. He called Mr. Big because the paper was so afraid of libel.
Wow.
But after the series, he could be revealed as Bill McCormack, and he was testifying on TV within 5 years. That's how big a change. And it started the Kefauver hearings, it started the Crime Commission hearings, and it exposed these guys as much as you could.
So this idea of stories you tell and stories you don't tell, that brings me over to Joseph here, because as a folklorist, that seems really key to your work. How do you enter the story of Pete Panto and this waterfront corruption story, Joseph?
Sure. So I have to say that I'm not a labor historian, right? I'm and not a historian. I'm a folklorist, cultural anthropologist who, and also a Brooklyn born and bred resident, proud to say. And my interest is in New York City and the communities in New York City, and in particular Italian Americans. And my introduction to Pete Panto was through Arthur Miller's memoir, Time Bends, where he talks about his own discovery walking along the docks and the shores of Brooklyn and seeing in chalk written on walls the graffiti, Dove Pete Panto? Where is Pete Panto? And he starts to inquire about it and discovers a little bit about Pete Panto. He meets a lawyer, Vincent Longhi. He actually travels to Italy with Longhi, and he develops certain things. He writes a screenplay that is supposed to be directed with Kazan, called The Hook, and they pitch it. And he tells a story about what happens that some people have contested. I kind of won't go into it here, but the idea was that Hollywood wanted to change out the mobsters for communists, and according to Miller, he was opposed to that. And he goes on then to write another doc story, The View from the Bridge. But what grabbed me about the Panto story, as Miller told it, was the fact that here was this Italian-American labor activist, and that someone who had been studying it up to that point, 20 years of Italian-American, New York City Italian-American history and culture, I had never heard of this guy. And I noticed that Italian Americans or spokespeople for Italian Americans, when they're looking for positive images that they want to see in the media, often turn to politicians, to business people, to war heroes. But the labor activists that were, fundamental to American history, people like Carlo Tresca, Virgilio De André, Angela Bombace, and a whole long slew of them have been, for all intents and purposes, written out of Italian American history, let alone American history. And of course, we understand that because these folks were associated with anarchism, with socialism, with communism, and that the ticket to assimilation meant that that was something you didn't want to be associated with. So that learning more about Panto as an Italian-American figure, as a New York City labor activist, was my entree into understanding a little bit more about the docks and the corruption that existed, and Panto's fight to change those conditions.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I've, in my own research into the waterfront and trying to talk about recent history of the waterfront, talking to various recent retired longshoremen and people in Carroll Gardens and Red Hook. It's often there's a point where in the conversation that one reaches, I've found that people don't want to talk anymore. And there's this issue still of what do we talk about and what don't we talk about?
Yeah. I had noticed in when I was researching it, that the guys on the West Coast, a completely different union, had a more positive experience, and they didn't get reticent at a certain point, and there weren't things that you don't talk about, because that was Harry Bridges' union. And so it was, the crude cartoon of it was Reds or Rackets, and that's the way the ILA split by West Coast and East Coast. And that was basically the fault of Joseph Ryan, who went out to the West Coast and tried to quell the Great Strike of 1934. They said, go back home. This is our union now. And the union split into a well-run, happier union, as far as I can tell. I was not a longshoreman myself, but the people that I interviewed, it always was remarkable the way some had survived and some had felt completely positive about their experience, and they had the same amount of time on the docks.
And I've in trying to learn more about containerization, which is something we're going to talk about here, and with Mark Levinson, who wrote the box on the 26th, the 65th anniversary of the first containerized shipment. Containerization is well documented on the West Coast, which seems to come off of what you're saying there. But those stories, that generation is almost gone. And of the people who experienced the time before containerization, and there's a lot of storytelling that I have not seen that happening on the East Coast, and that seems to be associated with what you're talking about. Joseph, I'm sorry, you
in 2001, I organized the symposium about Italians on the waterfront, which was a tribute to Panto. And we brought in scholars who talked about not only New York, but New Jersey, California as well. And in going around to advertise this symposium, we created this poster with Panto's image on it. And I walked all over Red Hook and Carroll Gardens, putting up the poster, asking people to put up the poster. And I remember going into a pizzeria and asking permission if I could put it up in the window. The owner said yes. And as I was doing so, there was an elderly man sitting at a booth, and he just said, "What are you doing?" And I explained to him about the poster, told him about the symposium, and he said, "Why do you want to bring that all up now?"
Wow.
And it's like, it was, here was 2001 and several decades later, and it was still a problem to have a conversation about.
That's remarkable. And here he is. This is the man we're talking about, Pete Panto. So we've got a big picture. We've really contextualized this well, I think. Let's get into the story. So what did Pete Panto do that upset people so much?
Can I just say one thing a little bit about Panto? Because I think we know so little about Panto the man, and recently with a friend of mine, Stephanie Romeo, we've been digging into online archives, and just to give some sort of basic facts about the guy. So we know that he was born in Brooklyn, September 13th, 1910. He was born Pietro Panto.
Yep.
And we know that he traveled back and forth between Italy. In 1924, Ellis Island, he's coming through, he's 14 years old. And then he's coming again in 1934 at age 24. And he's leaving from Palermo. So it's suggesting, one, that he's Sicilian, and two, that he may have been brought back as a child. He may have been brought to Italy by his parents, which was very common in those days. A lot of Italians, it's important to remember, came here to make money and to go back and buy property and buy land. The idea wasn't to stay in the United States. Over 50% of Italian immigrants went back and came back and forth. So we know that, we know this kind of little bit of information. And then it's in the late 1930s where we begin to understand and learn about his labor activism. I'll leave it to Nathan, but we know that he begins to lead a rank and file labor movement on the Brooklyn piers. create in June 1939. He's bringing together hundreds of longshoremen to the piers to organize against the corrupt ILA. So that's where things get really hot and heavy. And I'll leave it to Nathan then.
Well, the strict narrative from there is just, the context is from the Brooklyn Bridge to 20th Street, you have 5 miles of what they call the Camarda locals, controlled by the Camarda family. That's about 14,000, mostly Italian longshoremen. And he's thrown into that, and that's the culture that he discovers is that there's this whole system of earning the work. When I started writing, the thing I could not understand was how someone as honest and offended by the corruption would be made a hiring boss on a pier. And that I learned from various people I interviewed that what mattered to the union was the loyalty of the men on the pier. So if they were loyal to him, they would put up with his honesty and his not playing along otherwise, because he could get them the quickest turnaround of the ships coming in, and that's what was mattered, was the bottom. That was their bottom line. And eventually, with his leading these protests, that was not the deal according to them.
So there was like a tolerable. There were tolerances, and when you exceeded those,
yes, we'll put up with his honesty as long as he gets the job done. But if he starts telling people they don't have to put up with this stuff, that's where it escalated. And then of course, it's hard to there we go.
Yeah. So what are we, you mentioned territory, so I thought I'd bring in this map from your book, which is really revealing.
We're talking about where it says Red Hook to the Brooklyn Bridge.
Right. And then there are all these other territories with different people.
Well, in Manhattan, yes. Then you have the Sox Lanza controlled the fish market. Then you have Charlie Yanowski, that's on the Jersey side. That was big. And then the Dunn McGrath gang is the West Village. The O'Mara gang is Midtown. And the Bowers gang, the famous pistol local, 824, is at the top. And what these things have in common is that you usually had a foot in each world. So you'd have, Mickey Bowers might be technically in the union, but his cousin Harold was his gangster cousin. So he was the power behind. If you didn't listen to Mickey, you had him. The same with the Anastasio's brothers. You have Albert, who was in Murder Incorporated, and you had his brother, Tough Tony, who was in the union. And so it's a foot in each world. That's how I put it in the book. You can see the corruption there when they're you have one of each like that.
And we're coming right up here to the gates of the Navy Yard. It's we've spent a lot of time on these programs talking about the Navy Yard. So
yeah.
So I think that's an important landmark to point out here. I just want to take 2 seconds to look at a couple other images here. This is of course the image we saw at the top of the show. What's going on in this image, Nathan?
That's I think a Charles Barnes picture of,
yes.
I think it's a shape up in Chelsea, and this just shows you the horseshoe and the guy in the center picking for reasons of his own or for his boss's reasons, and that's how it was set up. This is like the teens, right?
Yeah, I think it's the early teens, late aughts. And so this is how you get hired to do work as a longshoreman before
yes.
the union houses
and it was in the union's interest to keep it casual like this, because it kept the men from being more powerful. I mean, if they had regular work and hiring hall and all the things they got later, they the whole arrangement between Joe Ryan and the shipping companies would have been impossible, because these guys would have had a lot more power as union members, instead
And
of
these are
having
day
to,
laborers. They don't know when they show up on a day whether they're going to get work or not. It frankly looks very much like what I see just down the block here on Northern Boulevard, and right between two big Home Depots, and you got the day laborers doing construction all lined up there outside the H Mart looking for work. And it's just the guy with the van or the truck is the one doing the picking instead of the union guy. We got a couple images of the work itself with these very, it looks like it'd be easy to get stuff out of this fall, as they call it, but it also looks like it would be easy for it to fall out of that rope. This is according to the caption, this is a car inside this crate, and this guy's just guiding along with his hand. You can see the combing on the hatch doesn't even get up to their knees. So this looks like incredibly dangerous work.
And longshoremen had one of the highest rates of injuries on the job, and as Nathan said before, no insurance, no real backing from the unions to take care of them. You get hurt, you're done.
Yeah, I think they always say that only the tree topping industry was more dangerous at the time, but I think they had more regular work also.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah. All right, let's so we've mentioned a few names. We talked about Pete Panto. So you have this guy who's very honest, and but because he's able to lead men and get them to work, that he is put in a position of some authority, but then he starts advocating for better working conditions.
That's right.
And what's the flashpoint? Where does it go bad for him after that? How bad does it go?
Well, this is he was still speaking into early July 1939, isn't that right?
Yes.
And then he was called into Emil Camarda's office at the end of President Street, right near the water there. And he said, I like you, but some of the boys don't like what you're doing. And some of the boys is code for mobsters. And so he refused to go along, and refused to stop speaking. And the next thing that happens in the timeline is he was getting ready to go out with his girlfriend on Bastille Day, 1939. He was dressed for that when he got a call at the cigar/stationery store across the street that
and here we are.
There we go. Sorry.
Yeah, so this is the Brooklyn Navy Yard at the end of the street. We're on North Elliott, and this was the house, number 11.
That's what they say. So then,
the address.
So then, Emil Camarda's limousine pulled up. It had a couple of other people he recognized, and one that he did not inside. He told his future brother-in-law, if I don't get back by 10 tomorrow morning, call the police. I'm just going to talk with a few mugs I don't like. And he was never seen again. They took him to Jersey and killed him in this house. And Albert Anastasia planned the murder. A guy named Mendy Weiss strangled him. And they trussed him up and buried him in this chicken farm where the mobsters buried some other victims.
And this is out in Lyndhurst, New Jersey.
In Lyndhurst, in a lime pit. Yeah.
Yep. So I have not visited the house.
Oh, but there is a house that we know an address.
Somewhere I probably have it. Yeah, yeah.
I'm not quite morbid enough myself to
That's
dig
it.
that out.
I
But,
mean, I have bothered some people to see what they're inside of their apartments, but I have not gone to the Linder's farmhouse.
and for those of you not
But
familiar
I'll bet other people have.
with that part of New Jersey, this is sort of northwest or northeast of Newark. Is that right? Kind of in the Meadowlands near
Yeah.
Giant Stadium, kind of.
Yep. Yep.
Gotcha. All right. So, but you said that that they buried him out there.
Right.
Sounds like they did find the body at some point.
About 18 months later, well, then you have to have the whole discovery of Murder Incorporated. So
okay, yeah. What was Murder Incorporated?
So, well, it was a newspaperman's term for what they called the combination. But the guy who was then the district attorney and would later become the mayor, Bill O'Dwyer, he's from Ireland. He had been a failed seminarian. He had been a waterfront cop. Then he was a lawyer. Then he was the district attorney of Brooklyn at this time. And he had a very smart lieutenant working for him named John Aznato, who was interviewing one guy in the Bronx jail and created a sort of climate of snitching that, everybody that put you up to this murder is already talking and getting deals. And it was widely believed throughout the cell block, so that Abe Rellis sent a message through his wife, tell O'Dwyer I want to talk. And so at 3 a.m, he came into the municipal building and met with Bill O'Dwyer and unspooled for him that there was a national syndicate. There were all these things that according to O'Dwyer, law enforcement was entirely ignorant of at the time. They thought all crime was local. There were gangs like, they didn't catch up with what had happened during Prohibition, which was crime had been nationalized. And one of the many, many things, he told him about 60 murders. And one of the many things he knew was the whereabouts of Peter Panto. And right. So O'Dwyer sent a steam shovel out and dug, and they eventually found a body, and Pete Panto's friend, Pete Matzi, dug him up with his own hands and then identified him by the gap in his teeth.
Wow.
So then they brought him back to Brooklyn, and that was it.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about what the community response was there. We did have a question from the audience. Do you know whether the Union president, Teddy Gleason, did he combat the influence of the mob? What do you know about him and his involvement?
At this point in time, I don't think he and Ryan liked each other, but he didn't have what Bill McCormick would call wings of purity. So I think he was still a member.
Got it. The language in this story is really fantastic. It's like you said at the beginning, all these terms that Bud Schulberger put in the movie.
They're all straight from. He sat week after week in those hearings, and that's another story, is how that movie came to be. That nobody wanted to make it when it was just a pseudo documentary about a reporter doggedly finding the story. But once he went to those hearings, he got all that stuff, and then introduced a romance, and apparently you have to have someone find their conscience in a movie. They can't start out with a conscience, or people aren't interested. I don't know why that is, but it's true. It explains why there isn't a straight up movie about Peter Panto.
That's
because he,
yeah. Wow, that's a very. I'm sure you've read up on Hollywood writing to some degree, but yeah, there's that structure you have to have, or at least they seem to think you have to have.
even when Mel Gibson is in a movie about the American Revolution, he's not interested in the cause until the Brits kill his son, and then it's personal.
As
now
they say in the trailer.
Now he's all in for the revolution.
Well, let's get back to Pete Panto and the what he any revolution that he may have caused. So they found him, and there was a funeral, and we've got this incredible photo.
Oh yeah.
So what happened next? What were people outraged by this? How did the community respond?
Well, it's difficult to say the community, right? Who are the members of the community? You had his fellow workers who supported him. And one of the things that they did create in his death was a organization called Il Circolo Educativo Pete Panto, which was designed to promote Panto's work, to uncover and bring to trial the murderers of Panto, which never happened, and Dwyer's involvement in doing that or not doing that is, something that's still up for discussion. But they continued to champion Panto and the rights of workers at the local level. So, how we know of other people like the American Communist Party, and the Labor Party were involved in uncovering what was going on with Panto, people like anarchists like Carlo Tresca, who I mentioned before. So a lot of these labor act, Vito Marcantonio, who was a congressman from Harlem, they were very vocal in keeping up the story of Panto for a while. For a while, until it kind of then got lost to history as things changed on the docks and more attention was brought to it on a national level.
You said that, Nathan, there was mention earlier about Arthur Miller seeing this graffiti. When was he seeing that graffiti? Was it in the immediate aftermath of Pete Panto's disappearance, or was this? How long was that graffiti visible?
My understanding.
Yeah,
my understanding of the way it's described, and I haven't read the book in a long time, that it was between his disappearance and his discovery, right? So from that late 39 to what is it, 40, 41? I forget when when his body's uncovered.
Got it. So we have a huge cast of characters here outside the movie. We've talked about Pete Panto. We've talked about Bill Dwyer. We've mentioned briefly Joseph Ryan and Albert Anastasia. So let's, how do we encapsulate the story? How do we make sense of all this? Where do we get the newspaper story comes in, and does that have a conclusion? So let's see if we can lay these people out. Pete Panto angered people, including Albert Anastasia, and was murdered, and there was an investigation.
Well, the interesting thing about Panto there is that he went on as both an inspiration to the Panto part of the workers, and the desired chilling effect, as like in Joseph's story, where the guy says, "What do you want to bring that up for?" That was the guy that was aimed at. Yeah. Was to keep you quiet. And then, but Joseph Ryan never called a strike in his decades as a strike leader, but the wildcat strikes that ultimately sapped away his power, it's 1951 especially, I see that as a culmination of what Panto had started in 1939. And that finally Ryan couldn't keep a hold of his whole union anymore, because whether they should have been afraid still or not, they overcame their fear.
I mean, I'll say something else adding to this and picking up on what Nathan just said was this question of fear. In the fall, in an attempt to get out get out of the house and from being in lockdown, I went to St. Charles Cemetery, where Panto is buried, and wanted to kind of just pay tribute and see where he is. And I was kind of surprised to find that there was no marker marking his grave.
Yeah.
We do know that Pasquale Pat Scotto was the person who oversaw, he was a funeral director in the Red Hook Carroll Gardens section, South Brooklyn, part of Brooklyn. And he oversaw the burial of Panto. The Scotto funeral parlor is the owner of the plot, as I've discovered. And so one wonders to what degree no marker was placed there because nobody wanted to bring attention to where he was, with maybe a fear of it being the plot being disrupted, somebody coming to desecrate the body yet again after being desecrated. So one of the things that I've been doing and working with others is trying to get a tombstone and a marker placed there at Panto's grave to just kind of simply mark his life in this one place where he's come to rest.
Wow. What are some of the things you're doing to make that happen?
Well, one of the things I'm doing is I've been in touch with the heirs of the Scotto Funeral Parlor. John Heyer is one of the people I'm working with, and also working with a tombstone company who has to go through the process of contacting the cemetery and figuring out what all the fees are and some of the back end that I'm not familiar with. And so once that all gets straightened out, what I hope to be doing in the near future is starting a GoFundMe campaign to raise the money. It's probably be about approximately $3,000, and hopefully do that and get a marketplace there. So stay tuned.
Yeah, it sounds like there's some support out there in the chat. So I hope we'll be able to, I know we have a lot of links, and hopefully some of them will get to you so people can stay tuned to that information.
I do think they were legitimately afraid of his body being taken. I mean, it was escorted from New Jersey on a truck with an escort because they were so afraid of the mob was going to grab his body. I don't know what else they were going to do with it, but I think Patsy Scotto he's the guy at the lead of that cortege that we were looking at.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned Scotto. That's a big name in Carroll Gardens still today.
Oh yeah.
So I don't know how far flung the family is, whether ever if you run into a Scotto, they're all related, or whether they're different branches. But one of the things I love about Brooklyn, despite all the changes, and God knows Carroll Gardens has changed a lot.
It sure has.
There is also a lot of consistency. People, you can still find traces going back quite a distance. Okay, so we've been talking about Pete Panto and the effect on the community. Where does this the Kefauver report? How does that come into the story?
All right. Well, so 10 years after what we've just been discussing is when Mike Johnson he was assigned a similar killing of a hiring boss at Pier 92 in Manhattan. Only it's not like Panto. In this case, they were fighting over the spoils, the grafty spoils of being the hiring boss, instead of resisting what they were told. So in this case, his boss, the New York Sun, said, "Go down there. This reminds me of a year ago, the Andy Heinz killing, who was also a hiring boss." And these things would be reported in the newspaper one at a time, and there would be a little rumor of dock wars, but they never tried to link them, and they never tried to explain them. And some of them, if you go do a search, you see one is a direct reprisal for the one the year before, and you really can control, connect the dots in a grisly way, but they weren't reported that way until Mike Johnson went down there and started asking questions. And the Panto-like thing about him is that he wasn't from the city. I mean, that's not Panto-like, but he was a reporter, but he was not cynical about that world. So he was offended. He was he couldn't believe that he hadn't known about this and had lived in the city that long, and he just kept asking questions. At first, he was resisted because he was a guy in a raincoat and a fedora. He looked like someone from the Rackets Bureau. Why should I ask? Why should I tell you what it's really like here on the docks? I'm just going to get in trouble. But he did finally find someone who would talk to him. And then the best thing that ever happened to him was the assistant DA named Bill Keating invited him to come see some papers he shouldn't have been able to see, but he was trying to light a fire under his own boss, the DA, to prosecute waterfront murders, which they rarely did because no one would testify. They would all pretend they hadn't seen anything, because they didn't want to be killed. But Bill Keating successfully prosecuted the first waterfront murder because the victim lived long enough to point out his killer, a guy named Cockeye Dunn, who ran the West Village docks. And that was a turning point. So then he brought in Mike Johnson, gave him all this information and all these contacts, and he took it from there, and he created this 24-part front page series for the New York Sun, which was then the 8th most popular of the 9 newspapers in New York.
Wow. So we have this series of articles, and it caught the attention of the public, I imagine, or was it overlooked?
It did. Everybody who worked on the waterfront was horrified to see it, unless they were, the dock workers. The police commissioner retired. He was given a job at Con Ed. By then, O'Dwyer was the mayor, and he didn't like where it was going, because it was going to bring up his past in Brooklyn. Everyone who should have been horrified was horrified, and it was on the front page for 24 days, which
wow.
is like, it wasn't the war. It's just very, very unusual at the time. And then at the same time, there was a wildcat strike against Joe Ryan. So, it was the first weakening of his power.
So how does this get to the federal level? Is there a direct link between the newspapers and the federal investigation?
Well, yes. Then Kefauver, quoted Mike Johnson's articles. He started this thing where they would go from city to city to city, investigating crimes in that city. But they didn't delve very deeply in each city. They just sort of embarrassed people and then moved on. There was 30 cities they went to, and they went to New York, and Thomas Dewey, the governor then, was embarrassed and angered and refused to cooperate with it. So that's how we came to have the New York Crime Commission hearings, which were the deepest, most substantive crime commission hearings that I've ever read. I mean, it's just an amazing document, and that's, in both cases, the Panto murder was brought back up, and O'Dwyer was scolded. He was brought back from Mexico, where he become. Well, now I'm skipping way ahead. Let's stay where we were.
Sure, sure. What can you tell us about the document we're looking at here? This is from your collection, Joseph.
Yeah, it's I recently bought it. In fact, had been looking at it for a while. It was published by the Communist Party, and it was showing the faults of the committee and in the investigation and the ongoing corruption and the lack of prosecution for Panto's death. And there's some verbatim, what I'm assuming is verbatim quote. It's presented as verbatim quote from the investigation, and is a way. And it went for 2 cents, as you can see on the cover there. So it was something that was distributed and made available at to a large group of people, and it was a way. I don't have the date on it, but it is again part of that ongoing grassroots level work that was being done to not only on behalf of Panto, but on the reform of the docks.
Yeah, I have to say the Daily Worker did some of the best reporting on the docks in those days. A lot of the quotes that I have in my book about we have families, we can't, all those quotes about how scared people were, or they all come from the Daily Worker. They really kept at it.
You said you didn't want to get ahead of yourself with mentioning O'Dwyer, but Andrew, who's working behind the scenes here, keeping everything running smoothly, he mentioned that described it as an escape hatch that O'Dwyer got an ambassadorship to Mexico.
Yes. Yes. He knew Spanish from when he was a seminarian in Spain before everything else, but he had to relearn it. But he was and he said that Harry Truman was his favorite American for setting it there. But before that, there was Cockeye Dunn, we mentioned before, was in Sing Sing. And there was a point where he was getting very close to his execution had been postponed 5 times. But this time, the DA said they want him to either talk or fry, as they said at the time. And he said he was going to talk, and that's when O'Dwyer resigned and said he wasn't going to run for office again, because if he was going to talk, a lot of people sought other jobs. Then he didn't talk. He was executed, and Mr. Big, Bill McCormack, went to O'Dwyer's office and said, "I'm the head of the draft O'Dwyer committee, and you're going to run again." And he did, and he came back and ran again.
Wow. So who was McCormack?
I'm not always a connect the dots person, but those dots are very connectable.
Initially I was going to say clearly no, just a coincidence that he resigned, but no. We mentioned this Mr. Big, this Bill McCormack a couple times. Why was he so big? Who was he?
Bill McCormack was he was among the many things he controlled was pen stevedoring. So all things that came to the water's edge and needed to go across the water to Manhattan, he controlled all that. He had concrete companies. He had scows. It just pretty much, if it was going to go across the harbor, he was in control of it. He called himself the little man's Port Authority, which was modest. And he's called Mr. Big by Johnson because that was the only name he couldn't print. Some people used aliases, but he couldn't. The paper was too afraid of him suing, as he did, and the way you can tell that he was successful in his articles was that within 2 years you could name Bill McCormack without fear, and then he was on he was testifying on national TV in these crime commission hearings.
Wow. It's such the book and the whole story is really a dissection of power and how how power is abused and then how it's unraveled, which it's just uh, it's remarkable that it was possible to unravel it as much as it did. Um, I don't know. Do you? There's a lot of questions about how you two have felt in doing your research on this, and are there times that you've been afraid and digging into these questions? What's been your emotional experience of uncovering this story?
I'll let you go, Nathan.
Well, what I would say is, if I could have found enough else about Panto to write the whole book about Panto, I would still be doing that. It's the most interesting thing I've ever written about. And in my books that I've done since, there'll be a certain character or somebody, and my wife will say, "Oh, that's your Panto," but it's not. It's meaning it's the thing you're most interested in the story, but it's never the same. It's I originally wanted to call the book Panto's Ghost because I thought it works both ways. It's the inspiration and the fear, making an example of him. But my editor did not see it that way. So, and there are other things in the book than the Panto story, which is about 10 pages. But,
right, but as you suggest, it is where so much, at least in your telling and the telling that we've been hearing here today, Panto is where this seems to begin, where
yes,
a lot of the energy derives from. It's the seed.
Yes, but for both sides, that's right. But I really enjoy it. As I said, I wish I could have found more. I emailed everyone named Panto in the United States, as far as I can tell, and then he didn't have any children, so it was a long shot. But they were all glad to hear about his story, and they never had heard it before. That was the interesting thing, to be named Panto, but not know about Pete Panto. That says it all, right?
And what about you, Joseph? Anything you want to share about your investigation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm operating in a different sphere, right? I'm at a CUNY Research Institute and also tapping into scholars who have done this research. So to a large degree, I'm sort of setting up an event and inviting people to present their work. I will say that when I was promoting this 2001 symposium on dock workers and a tribute to Pete Panto, I did have somebody, and I won't even suggest who they are, when I said something to the effect that the Albert Anastasia called for the murder of Panto, and I was told, well, he's never been convicted of that, so it has to be alleged. And the news, all the publicity went out already, but the person was rather upset, and I was like, why is this an issue for you? Why do you are so concerned with the reputation of a gangster, of a known gangster, in the murder of a labor activist? And so that was the only kind of pushback that I got regarding that work. But I think at this point, 2001, when I did the symposium, Nathan's book afterwards, I mean, that world is, especially on the dock, is gone, right? And those figures are long gone, and the web of intrigue and power relationship is history. And also to say, I'm involved in scholarly work and a university presentation. It doesn't have the same kind of impact that a multiple series of newspaper articles at the time had. Right. I mean, really kind of blowing the lid on things. It's historical research. It's not lived reality anymore.
Well, I hope folks will check out the links that we've shared for the conference. I've watched them myself and found the presentations that were in those videos fascinating. Of course, my initial engagement with this was through the Waterfront Museum, where you mentioned the script The Hook, which had been a screenplay that was never produced, and the View from the Bridge, which are the screenplay has been produced in a stage adaptation at the Waterfront Museum. They did that last year, before the pandemic, whenever that was, and. So there's a lot of work going on around these stories, particularly with the Waterfront Museum. You talk about 2001 being a different world with people, that generation going away, and certainly at the Waterfront Museum, we're very interested in learning more about. We want to talk to these people from before containerization, and like I said, they're gone now.
It's great that you mentioned the museum, because a big shout out to Claire Beckman, right, and the Brave New World Repertory Theater, who was about to stage The Hook just before COVID hit us all. So I'm looking forward. I think Nathan and I both got to see a reading of it, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that staging once everything is settled down and return to normal.
Absolutely, back to the theater, and we'll if we don't get the Brave New World link in right now, we'll include that in the follow-up email. Any last remarks? What do you want people to remember about Pete Panto when they go off to the rest of their lives today?
Well, what I do wish is that Mr. Longy were still alive to be on this show. I mean, that guy, he connected so many people together. I mean, he is Arthur Miller's guide to the waterfront. He's got into it because of Pete Panto, and he was such an elegant speaker. So if they can go on the link and watch his presentation from 2001, they'll have learned something. That guy was a great person.
And he inspired the character in the View from the Bridge. Am I right about that?
That's right.
Alfieri, yeah.
He's the lawyer there.
Although,
he's also fascinating because he shipped out in the during World War I with Woody Guthrie and wrote a memoir about that. So what is it? And Cisco Houston. So that's also worth looking at. In the video that I believe you said you had a link to of the symposium, Longy is one of the presenters there. I'll say in conclusion that, I think, again, from the Italian-American perspective, it's important to know that Italian-American men, Italian-American women were active in fighting for the rights of working people. And that is very much part of American history that is important to reclaim and learn from, and understand that history is a very complicated one and a legacy worth remembering in 2000 and in 2021.
I can't thank you enough, especially for bringing us in on that extraordinarily positive note and hopeful. And I do hope that our audience will check out your publications and your continuing work, and support Joseph, your efforts to make sure that we have a marker on Pete Panto's grave, and that we'll go out and share the story broadly. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Oh,
thank you, Stefan.
Our pleasure.
We'll see everyone again soon. Check out our walking tour of the perimeter of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and you can see that last residence of Pete Panto, and look at our upcoming programs as well. Take care, everyone, and be safe.